Verse 20, the prodigal son gets up and he goes to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. So we've had the father's pain. This is now the father's compassion. It says here, he's filled with compassion. Filled with compassion. The old authorized version uses a phrase in some parts of it, the bowels of compassion. You remember that old phrase, the bowels of compassion? It's related to the Greek word that's used in the scriptures, because the Greek word that's used in the scriptures for compassion literally it comes from the word meaning your guts, your intestines, yeah? There's something about compassion which hits you or flows from this deep inward spiritual part of you. Are you with me? How many of you know what that is? Yeah, that surge of compassion that you feel from deep down within. That's what the father said. That's what the father felt. Now, one of the issues that we have to understand here is that this man has been carrying pain, grief, worry, dashed hopes for several years. He thinks his son might be dead. He hasn't understood, he hasn't known, he hasn't heard anything of where his son might be, except what's fed down the grapevine, perhaps. If you get treated like that by one of your own children that you brought into the world, that you have invested all of your time in trying to clothe, feed, bring up, do your level best with, and the younger son responds like that, it's like a big slap in the face. This father has allowed his pain to mature and to grow his own heart. The thing here, when you hit the bit about compassion and running to his son and embracing him and kissing him, it's at that point where we begin to diverge from some of what we actually do or the way that we respond and react in human life. This is a picture of God's compassion. This is a picture of God's Father heart towards the repentant sinner. We're not always filled with compassion when younger son, proverbially, repents and comes home. The father didn't scold him. The father didn't tell him off. The father didn't give him a long lecture on wasting the inheritance and how you should never have behaved that way for so many years. That's just slapping him in the face in return. But the very way that we are wired up tempts us to do exactly that. The big temptation for the father was to harden his own heart. I've brought you up for 20 years. I've invested everything I have in you. You've responded by treating me that way. You've even taken 1/3 of all of the things I have ever built up and banked away. I've given it to you in free generosity as your inheritance. And what did you do with it? You blew it all. You went and gambled it all away in one night, as it were. The father would very easily be tempted to harden his own heart towards the younger son, to cast him off. And even if he received him back in the house, yet still to hold an attitude of unforgiveness and a grudge against his younger son, allowing a root of bitterness, hardness and unforgiveness in the very atmosphere and life of that family. How many of you know what that's like? How many have ever seen family life where there's a broken relationship that stays broken because of unforgiveness, rooted in the hurt that one of them received? The hardening of the heart is the temptation. Hardening your heart, which would have led to rejection of the younger son, even against a family member, would have caused the father to remain self-centered and, in a sense, not to allow the circumstances to mature and to grow his own heart. It's the willingness to endure, and it's the willingness to embrace the pain of life which leads to increased maturity. See, if we want to be like God, we have to learn to embrace the pain of life just as God himself does. In sending his own Son into this world to redeem us, God embraced the pain of this world. God didn't push it away saying, it's hurt me, it's slapped me in the face, they do evil, they sin, and I'm going to get involved, I'm going to embrace this whole thing, and I'm going to work it through. Romans 5 verse 20 says that where sin abounds, grace does much more abound. Where sin increased, grace increased. Grace increased. What we need to do to become more like God is to get rooted in the grace of God and to learn to respond to situations with grace. Grace. Without grace, the father cannot embrace the younger son. The younger son's brought too much destruction. He's broken too many things. He's broken too many rules. He's said too many words. He's done too many bad things, and it's caused a divide between them. But if the father allows him to stay on one side of the divide, then the father can no longer bring a solution to the problem and bring that younger son into true reconciliation with himself. He can't do it. The lack of grace and the holding on to his own hurts will prevent that from happening. It will isolate the father emotionally. How many fathers do we have who are emotionally detached from their children because they themselves are holding on to hurt that those children have caused? Or that their marriages have caused? Greatest thing that we need in marriage is grace and forgiveness. Grace. It's grace, abundant grace, which brings the ability and the willingness to forgive. It's grace which says, you've messed up bad, big time, this time, but I'm not going to let you go. It's grace which will say, I made a choice. I married your mum. We together gave birth to you and your older brother. That is the choice we made. And that is a choice which will then determine a lot of things for the rest of our natural life. Because whether I like it or not, younger son, you're never going to go away. And even though you've been a fool, and even though you've wasted everything, and even though you've hurt me, and you've hurt your mum, and you've angered your older brother, yet still you are still a member of this family, and we have to work this thing through. How many families get splintered, cracked, divided, because somebody messed up and then the hurt got shed around and there's bitterness there, or there's sin. Never letting go. Living in grace, living in hope, living in faith, and living by prayer. And in this man's case, it's grace which won the day. Through all of that period where his younger son is away, he's praying constantly, I believe. He's grieving constantly, but he's holding on to God at the same time and allowing God to minister grace to him on a daily and a weekly basis, so that when the son finally comes back, there is grace to meet him at the door. If there's no seeking of God, and if there's no real grace working in my life, then when younger son comes back, he simply gets a slap in the face, as it were. He gets rejected, or I respond in a way which then makes him feel rejected, because I speak out of anger and hurt. Grace. Grace. Characteristic of true Christian religion. What it's all about. It's grace towards the repentant sinner. Rejoicing. So he's filled with compassion. He runs to him. And he doesn't. And he embraces him. He knows that the time has finally come where the youngest son really has learnt his lesson. The lesson that the older son learnt the easy way by making the right choice at the critical time. He knows that the younger son had to wander and be involved in all of that sinful world, but eventually he comes out of it and he comes back home, and this time he has learnt his lesson. When he has learnt his lesson, finally, he's got to be covered in grace. The Father's heart is so graceful and so full of compassion that the most difficult thing that the younger son would then face from then on is forgiving himself. And really persuading himself that even though he'd completely messed up, yet his father still loved him. See, there's something about our sinfulness which persuades our mind, God could never receive me, God could never forgive me, God could never do anything again with me because I've messed up. But that simply doesn't show just how deep and abundant is the grace and the love of God. God's grace and compassion is so abundant, it will receive that which is repentant and give it a completely new start. So we've got the Father's joy. The Father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. He really does spoil him. He piles it all on big time to try to convince the younger son, I really do have forgiven you. I've given you free forgiveness, freely, freely, freely. I've poured it on you, and I've poured grace upon you. So know that you are accepted back into my home. Don't hold on to your children's failures. Allow God to take what you're going through and to enlarge your own heart in response. Have the maturity to be willing to experience and embrace the roller coaster of negative emotions that you will experience as you go through the pain of seeing a child mess up. That's one of the greatest things I've learned about being a father. Whether you like it or not, you have to embrace it. You have to embrace it to yourself. You have to make the pain part of your life. Otherwise, there becomes a barrier between you and the child which is insurmountable. See, the younger son doesn't have to show grace. The younger son has to learn his lesson. And he does eventually. But it's the father's role to show grace. He was a good father, not because he was generous, and not simply because he piled all of his stuff on his son when he came back home and really did spoil him. He was a good father because he had a heart for his own children. Look in Malachi, chapter 4, verse 6. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. That's integrated into this story. The heart of the prodigal turns back to his father. Why? Because he knows his father has got a heart for his children and his family. And all of the destructive sin still hasn't erased that deep conviction from his own heart. But look at that. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. He's a good father because his heart will embrace his children. An immature father doesn't know how to show emotion. He doesn't know how to embrace. He doesn't know how to say, I love you. He doesn't know how to pray with his children. He doesn't even know how to read the Bible to his children. An immature father keeps himself emotionally detached and spiritually detached instead of understanding that's his very role, why he's a dad. You've got to embrace it as a father. Not leave everything to the mother who does care for the children emotionally and spiritually. Women pray, women read the Bible to them, women do an awful lot of stuff that the fathers neglect because the fathers keep themselves detached. What men need is to get to the stage where they will be big-hearted men. Big hearts. You know, Braveheart, you've heard of that film, haven't you? Big heart. Big heart. The father was rich, the father was wealthy, he had a successful business. But the thing that crowns it all in their family life is that dad values relationship more than money, more than what we've got, more than what we can build up, more than what we can do, more than his daily agenda, more than his management of the business. He values his relationship with his children more than anything else. Heart. And the willingness to express heart and be led by heart, not just by head. But the big thing about the man here is that he's prepared to show his heart. And when the child comes home, the man literally drops everything. He says, "Quick, bring the best robe." Like any man, he's in the middle of a busy day or in the middle of a busy evening. He's doing something, he's planned something, he's got an agenda. He's got things he needs to get through his daily work. And for a man, a day's work is important. Men are work-orientated. God made Adam to work the garden. It's intrinsic to a male to want to work and to plan the day of work. But look at this man. When younger son comes back, he drops it. He doesn't say, "Wait until 6 o'clock when I've finished." Naughty boy. He drops everything to embrace his own son. And the son himself becomes the center of attention for a while. That's heart. Malachi 4:6. "I will turn the hearts of the fathers to the kids, the hearts of the children to the fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse." The curse is hard-heartedness. The curse is refusal to forgive. The curse is refusal to put things right and to reconcile. The curse is living a self-centered life in the midst of fractured relationships. But the blessing comes through showing abundance of grace, through embracing that younger son. The blessing comes on focusing on the relationship and valuing that above everything else. We need fathers who won't give up, who are willing to embrace the pain and the gamut of emotions. We need fathers who will mature into God's own large-heartedness and who know what it means to continue to demonstrate grace in the context of fractured relationships. Look at Genesis 45, verses 26 to 28. This is Jacob again. They told him, finally, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he's the ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. Israel said, "I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Have you got verse 27 there? He was stunned. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe that what he thought about this son being dead and lost was not true. Things could change. And verse 27 says, his spirit revived. And it's an interesting thing there, that when you go from verse 27 to verse 28, it changes his name. Jacob has his heart revived. In the next verse, verse 28, he's called Israel. He can deal with our children. He can deal with our grown-up children. He can deal with the mess that some of them may have created in their life. And he can eventually bring the whole thing round, full circle, and present his work in their life. See, there are some things that we cannot do. There are some things that only God can do. And God can do it. In Jacob's life, it took 20 years. Joseph was away for 20 years. He's 17 when he sees the dream. He's 30 when he gets out of prison and becomes a prime minister. Then you've got 7 more years of plenty, and then you're into the years of famine. So that's at least 23 years, give or take. So let's say it's between 20 and 25 years he hasn't seen him. But in the meantime, God has done something in Joseph's life. God did something in the life of the prodigal and turned things around through his own suffering to bring him back home. His spirit revived. Weeping might endure for a night, and it does endure for a night, but joy comes again in the morning. It was the father's response and the father's godlike attitude which restored that repentant son into relationship again and into the family. What would have happened if the prodigal had come home repentant but had met a hard-hearted response? The father would have simply isolated himself emotionally, never known the joy of restored relationship, and would have spent the rest of his life hurting his own heart wounds, instead of growing beyond that into the realm of grace. So it's a celebration here, not because the father's a fool, but because God has worked in the life of the father and brought the father to the point where compassion and grace are reigning. And it's that response from the father that allows the family to be united again. The problem from then on would never have been the father's. It would have been the relationship between the older and the younger sons. One had to learn to forgive. The older son had to learn to become like his own father. But maybe he's still young and not mature enough yet to have reached that stage. And the problem that the younger son would have would be forgiving himself. And that's the role of the father, to help him through that. But the father has to get the victory in himself first.